Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. These are some images of a made-in-China vessel being hit and eventually sunk as part of US and Philippine drills 400 kilometers from the Taiwan Strait. On the same day, Beijing sent 11 Chinese vessels, including Coast Guard ships, into Taiwan's waters off the Jinmen Islands. Meanwhile, China alleges it reached a new model agreement with the Philippines around the resupply of Second Thomas Shoal, which Manila rejects. We're asking about the increasing connections between the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. Joining us to discuss this today are Chong Ja, National University of Singapore, Department of Political Science, Associate Professor, and Stephen Wang, Office of R.O.C. Legislator, Chiao-hsin, Foreign Policy Advisor. Very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. In a possible escalation, China said it is planning to release a recording of a January 3rd phone call between a Chinese diplomat and the head of the Philippine Armed Forces for the Western Command, Vice Admiral Alberto Carlos. The recording, it says, proves the two sides had reached a new agreement over Second Thomas Shoal. In the transcript published by the Manila Times, Carlos agrees that resupplies to soldiers on the beached Sierra Madre will only contain food and medical supplies, meaning not construction materials to enhance the life of the ship. He also confirms to the Chinese diplomat that General Brawner, Secretaries Guibo Tidora and Eduardo Arno have agreed to the proposal. So let me come to you first, Professor Chong. Romeo Brawner, Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, said that the Beijing may be using a deep fake in order to essentially fabricate the proof of the recording of this conversation. What are the stakes for both sides?
So I think for Beijing, they want to obviously put themselves in a sort of stronger, I also hesitate to say legal position, but at least a stronger diplomatic position, saying that the Philippines had made some agreement, that's the claim, and then had reneged. So the Philippines ought to keep to the agreement. For the Philippines, obviously, they don't want to be in a position where they are seen to be giving up on their sovereign claims. And at the same time, the Marcos administration would want to also appear that its officials are not going rogue, that it has control over its officials. So I mean, there's quite a lot at play here. There's quite a lot at stake.
Why would the Philippines agree to essentially giving up their sovereignty? The Sierra Madre is basically beached there to mark it as their sovereign territory.
Right. So the transcript, I think, is a bit mystifying to me, because there are these claims that it's some sort of agreement or arrangement. One reading, of course, is that this is fabricated. It is also possible that it is a snippet of a longer conversation, just to avoid escalation. Now, these sorts of more tactical arrangements sometimes are done without prejudice to any claim. But it seems that Beijing is pushing for a sort of wider interpretation. So the fact that there is no
a wider interpretation
of the arrangement, right? So that it means that the Philippines is willing to sort of step back on its claims. That seems to be the undertone. But I mean, overall, with these kinds of claims of agreements that are not independently verifiable, it's difficult for anyone to say with certainty. What it might do is to decrease some of the credibility of the Marcos administration. It may either because they look like they're walking back on promises, or because it seems like they're disorganized. But that sort of second bit may be the tactical advantage that Beijing may wish to seek.
Okay. Stephen, why would the Chinese side not release this audio if they had it?
Well, I think the Chinese, what they're doing right now is to create a sense of ambiguity and kind of like unpredictability. The Chinese at this point kind of give, precisely like the professor says, two different scenarios, right? But I do believe in both of those scenarios, China might be putting itself into a very counterproductive position. First one, let's assume that this is a fake one, right? So you're basically attempting to cause some sort of confusion and also trying to destroy some sort of cohesions within the Philippines command structures. And I think the chief of the Philippines Armed Forces has made a very stabilizing narrative, by basically saying that this might be a so-called fake incident. But let's assume this is real. I think China also is playing a very bad hand because it kind of shows, even though to a certain extent, it kind of shows how China, to a certain degree on a lower level, is willing to demonstrate some sort of flexibility when it comes to how to de-escalate situations. But by kind of forfeit that sort of ambiguity, by kind of making it public, I think they are, in a sense, not providing themselves with any sorts of options in the future like
this. You say flexibility, Stephen, but really in this, what we've seen from the Manila Times is essentially agreeing to everything that China wants. No construction materials, notice before it happens, 1+1, just one Coast Guard ship plus one civilian. Whereas, you know, actually we know that the Marcos administration has been working towards what it hopes is allied support.
Yes.
You know, especially around the resupply missions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so number one, it is very hard perhaps for every single one of us here to kind of experience or kind of understand what sort of tactical or some sort of security pressure perhaps the local commander is facing at that moment. There is some sort of, perhaps you can say, necessary confrontation of some sort of operational reality that maybe the local armed forces of the Philippines are facing at that point. So they need to find out some sort of short-term solution in terms of this.
Professor Chong, so do you think that this China's new model sounds very much like the gentleman's agreement between Rodrigo Duterte, the former Philippine president, and Xi Jinping?
Right. So it's on one hand, I think the supposed gentleman's agreement. I'm doubtful whether or how much it actually exists. But the point of the new model is to really get to the Philippines to agree to the PRC's position anyway. And they weren't able to secure more, make the Marcos administration more forthcoming. So I guess they're trying again with this sort of threat of perhaps escalation in the background. But I would also say that once you throw this gentleman's agreement and also the recording out, it also undermines the PRC's credibility. It would seem like it's an entity that is willing to throw out information without any verification, without any ability for anyone to independently see whether this is correct. So in interactions in future with the Philippines or anybody else, you do have to wonder whether the PRC will be forthcoming, whether they will be upfront about what's going on, or whether they will come up with some fabrication. Just like the way that you promised me $1 million earlier on, that's our gentleman's agreement. Right?
Right, exactly. Stephen, so why now? This was back in January 3rd, so what's the timing of this?
I think obviously this is coincided with how the recently ended, you could say, U.S.-Philippine military exercise has recently just happened. I think China wants to throw in something more to kind of extend this conversation. But let's also go back to this idea of gentleman's agreement. I think when it comes to any sorts of agreements of the PRC, in areas where there's a lot of fundamental disagreements, and China has a lot of that, PRC has a kind of constrained itself with this habit of calling almost every territorial disputes that it finds interesting, want to claim as core interests. You're not leaving yourself a lot of rooms for negotiation. You're not leaving yourself for other countries to also compromise with you at this point. So.
Right. And interesting you brought up core interests. Obviously, that's applied to Taiwan as well as the South China Sea. Now, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian said at a press conference that if the Philippines wants to de-escalate the situation in the South China Sea, it should practice 5 stops. Take a look.
如果菲方真正想缓和南海局势，就应当立即停止冲闯中国南沙群岛和黄岩岛邻近海域，停止向仁爱礁非法坐滩的军舰运送建筑物资并修建永久设施，停止在有关无人岛礁非法的登礁活动，停止拉帮结派、炫耀武力，停止散布虚假信息，误导国际社会。
This was triggered by Manila saying it wouldn't escalate the situation by using Philippine water cannon against the Chinese. Professor Chong, what do you make of China's demands, the 5 stops?
Well, the 5 stops are all essentially, on China's terms, on the PRC's terms. In essence, it's laying out what the PRC wants the Philippines to do. Perhaps it is a opening effort at negotiation, but is a very strong position, which I think the Philippines will be hard pressed to accept, especially once you think about the Philippines and their nationalism. They have that as well. I think to look like to have the Marcos administration look like it's caving in to PRC demands, that they may have to pay some political cost to that. So I think it's unlikely. Perhaps what is going on, I'm certain that the PRC is aware of the Philippine situation. So I think what might be going on is to try to create this overall narrative that the Philippines is somehow in the wrong. Let us not forget that the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal basically says that these features in the South China, in the Spratlys, they're not islands, so they can't generate things like exclusive economic zones, so on and so forth. So what it looks like then is when you look at Scarborough Shoal, when you look like parts of the Spratlys, they appear to be within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, and they're far closer to the Palawan coast than the coast of the PRC mainland. So this sort of narrative makes it seem, I mean, you've heard the language, right? It makes it seem that what the Philippines is doing is illegal, but that's, I think, trying to change the narrative and trying to shift the attention away from the more, perhaps, shaky legal ground that the PRC's own claims might be.
Stephen, a good point there. In your view, which party should carry out these 5 stops?
Is kind of fitting when the Chinese going to propose 5 stops. There is an interesting saying, I don't know if it exists in English, but in Chinese we also say if you point a finger at one person, you're pointing forward by yourself, right? So the spokesperson, besides the one point where he says about assembling a gang together, a show of force, if you extract some terminology, some names out of the other 4 stops, and then you put into the Chinese context, that's exactly what they're doing. So I think to a certain degree, I would say China has been kind of consistent when it comes to trying to figure out some interesting slogans for what they're doing.
Creative.
Very creative.
Very creative, yes. Professor Chong, would you agree that most people, when they listen to this narrative, as Stephen just said, they would flip it so that, in fact, it's China that needs to stop with these 5 different kinds of action?
So I think there are multiple audiences that we're looking at when the PRC puts out these sorts of statements. I think on the one hand, there is the external audience where they're trying to slowly shift the narrative. So maybe many people now will think that, well, these 5 stops should apply to the PRC. But maybe the hope is, give it some time. Maybe things can change perceptions and people will come around. But the other is, I think there's a domestic element to this where it is to reinforce this idea domestically within the PRC that there are all these other states that are out there that are ganging up on the PRC and really impinging on PRC interests. And of course, the way that Beijing likes to couch this is that there is the United States that's behind all of this. I mean, yes, they are a treaty ally of the Philippines, but I'm quite sure that the Philippines is able to exercise their own agency.
Stephen, so one of the attack simulations in this year's Balikatan was the sinking of that Philippine Navy ship, was originally a Chinese oil tanker decommissioned in 2020. Now, this was, as we said, 400 kilometers from the Taiwan Strait, so very, very close, and the Philippine military stressed that the ship's origin was not symbolic or even intentional. So what message, though, do you think it sent to Beijing? We saw the quite dramatic footage at the start of the show.
I think it's a little bit tricky when it comes to, how do you walk the fine line between giving some people interesting speculations and also trying to say this has nothing to do with the other case. I think this is a very strong statement, and I think this is a very good statement. It is to basically say that, the U.S. and the Philippines are in their next military exercise, they want to upgrade it into a full-scale invasion scenario, I think. And I think that's good in a way that you are giving the Philippines more confidence by solidifying the security ties between the two countries, and particularly what Taiwan is very particularly jealous about. It's about enhancing the interoperabilities between the two militaries.
Yeah, because Taiwan cannot train with other militaries, of course. So as Stephen mentioned, as this year's Balikatan wrapped up, Defence Secretary Gilbert Tidoro announced next year's exercises would simulate a full-scale battle. And a day following the exercises, the Chinese Navy sent a destroyer division to carry out anti-missile and anti-submarine drills in the South China Sea. The division includes a Zunyi, a Type 055 guided missile destroyer, one of the world's most powerful such warships. Other destroyers include Haikou, Kunming and Shenang, and they were deployed in a, quote, sea strike tactical formation ready to strike targets coming from the air, the surface of the water and underwater. So, Professor Chong, let me ask you, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian called on relevant countries to stop provocations and provoking confrontation. So how do you see it? Who is provoking who?
So this sort of veiled gesture at the United States has been around for a while. The PRC has claimed for a long time that it is literally the United States stirring the waters and driving these various states to lay their claims. I don't think that's completely accurate. I think, yes, the U.S. presence, especially with allies like the Philippines, does make them a little bit more confident. But these claims, are of those states themselves, and for really since independence, much like the PRC claims, although they claim that it's historical.
But what's the root of this? I mean, why has the Philippines switched from its
right? I'm getting there. So I just wanted to lay out the sort of the fact that the sort of history is there.
Yeah.
But this current round, I think for the Philippines, they got very, very serious about their defense and looking, northward as well as westward after the military exercises following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
In August 2022.
That's right. So the PRC, some of the PRC exercise areas was just off Philippine territorial waters. This is 12 nautical miles off of the baseline, their coast, essentially. And so the Philippines realized that they face a real potential risk of escalation with the PRC. They may be drawn into conflict situations not of their own doing. So they decided that they wanted to be more, develop their own capabilities, but not just for defense, but also I think with the ship sinking, to send a signal that any efforts to attack the Philippines will be potentially costly. Of course, the PRC counter sort of messaging is that they are able to block all of this.
Stephen, was it also because Marcos's attempts to build a better relationship with Xi Jinping seemed to fail a month after the state visit by Marcos to China? There was the military laser incident, and then rapidly followed many incidents, the ramming, the buoys being set up.
Precisely like the professor says, I think Philippines is getting very serious about its security situation. A lot of people kind of pay attention, well, some people do kind of pay attention to not only just the military exercise during the Pelosi's visit, but also let's recall back in 1996 and 1995, where there's the Taiwan Strait crisis, right? The fact that some missiles landed very close to some Japanese island had resulted in a review of the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. I think, if China continues to do all these very provocative incidences, adding on to the threat perception that the Philippines is increasingly sensing, precisely like you said, President Marcos tries to use diplomatic means, but it seems that China is not backing down. So he has to do what he thinks is best for his country.
Right. Professor Chong, so on the same day as the sinking of this ship, Beijing also sent 11 Chinese vessels into Taiwan's waters around Jinmen Island. Do you think this was a coincidence?
So I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean, we can probably debate how much it was coordinated, but at any rate, one thing is that Beijing is highly opaque. We don't know exactly what their decision making is. But the bigger point is that on the maritime front, the PRC has been stepping up pressure on all the against all of the sort of actors that it has claims against. So we have the Philippines. You have some degree, some negotiation with Vietnam. If you look at the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, there's pressure on the Japanese. And quite recently, there was an Australian helicopter that was trying to enforce UN sanctions around the Korean Peninsula, and you had the PRC military aircraft drop flares in front of it. So it's not just the Taiwan or South China Sea. I think from essentially the Yellow Sea through the East Sea, the Taiwan Strait to the South China Sea, we are seeing a certain consistency in the pattern of PRC behavior.
So you don't believe it was sending a message actually to the Philippines and the US to kind of stay out of Taiwan's issues?
So I think that's a consistent message. It's not specific to this incident. When you look at the pressure around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, that also sends a message to the U.S. and also to Japan. Basically, everyone to sort of stay out of this sort of general area that the PRC has claims. The fact that you have the release of flares in front of an Australian military helicopter that was trying to enforce UN sanctions suggests that even in the sort of vicinity of the Yellow Sea, that's an area that the PRC wants to have a veto over, and so too with the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. I think there's a certain consistency of claims. The PRC wants to be able to exert a veto over who is able to operate, in the waters that it claims that it owns.
Final question. So the Philippines says China is using a disinformation campaign to distract from its aggressions in the West Philippine Sea and to divide Philippine society. Senator Jongay Estrada called on the military to remain loyal to the Philippine flag and to be vigilant against any underhanded tactics that may weaken our position. We must stand united in defense of our territorial rights, as our strength lies in our unity. So, Stephen, how damaging can these kinds of disinformation tactics be? Can you perhaps talk from a Taiwan perspective?
Oh, absolutely. It really depends on how coordinated the local and central government officials can be, and also when it comes to how sensitive and critical our citizens are when it comes to sources of different news reports and everything. In the case of Taiwan, I do think to a certain extent we have established a kind of like a robust fact-checking and also a rapid response when it comes to some fake news being reported. Just one very interesting incident was during the COVID period, where you do have some false documents from some municipalities floating around different social media groups about how the entire city of Taoyuan, Tainan is going to go into full shutdown. But I think the government and the civilian entities kind of reacted to that quickly. So I think that's the key.
Professor Chong, would you like to add to that?
So I think disinformation, it can be highly disrupting, and one of the sort of more traditional ways of looking at disinformation, what you might think about in terms of information operations in a sort of military context, is to sow confusion in an adversary, to delay the reaction, to blunt their responses, and insofar as we are seeing this being deployed. Disinformation, that is, it's become a increasingly common tactic used by the PRC and others. Stephen talked about COVID. I mean, there was also a lot of disinformation about COVID origin, that the Fort Detrick conspiracy, that the PRC was trying to push to draw attention away from itself. There was the effort by Russia to talk about how the invasion of Ukraine was to go after Nazis and was a result of NATO provocation. So, given the easy access to information and the sort of real ability for people to just latch onto whatever they like to hear, disinformation has become an increasingly useful tool for actors that think they're useful to distract, confuse the other.
And does it exacerbate existing divisions in society?
Oh, so a lot of how disinformation works is to play on existing divisions, cleavages, doubts.
So in the Philippines, what would that be?
Oh, so in the Philippines, like all societies and all pluralistic societies, there are lots of debates. I mean, some of it has to do with whether and how much a standing up for Philippine sovereignty might cost. the Philippine economy in general, but also individuals, individual provinces. There's a question of the loyalty of the Philippine Armed Forces. There's a question of the leanings of the Marcos administration, whether it's willing to work for Philippine interests or some other interest. All that, I mean, not a lot of this, of course, doesn't have to be true. Just people just have to believe in it. And once it exists, once it's in the water, actors outside or sometimes internally as well can try to manipulate these sorts of beliefs.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Ian Chong and Stephen Wang, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world. Charted by the freest country in Asia.
5, 4, 3, 2.
A warm welcome to Taiwan Plus News. I'm Ian Kavat. Taiwanese semiconductor giant TSMC.
Public buses to be electric by 2030. A mission that begins with listening.
And telling the stories of Taiwan.
In Taipei for Taiwan Plus.
Drawing insight from original thinkers.
And sharing it with the world. Taiwan Plus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.